Welcome back. You already know quite a lot about the Chernobyl disaster itself and its immediate aftermath and effects on human health and ecosystems. Now we're going to speak a little bit about the science policy interactions over post-Chernobyl governance, specifically in Belarus. This is the outline of our lecture today. First, I will introduce you to science policy context in Belarus and USSR. Then we'll speak a little bit about science policy interaction over acceptable doses of ionizing radiation. Then I will move to science policy interactions over the management of exposures to low levels of ionizing radiation. And we'll speak a little bit about scientific evidence, knowledge, and precaution in this context. The questions related to the management of Chernobyl aftermath became very political in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union basically was a very apolitical society. At least that's what people used to think about it. But citizens were extremely frustrated and disappointed at the inability of the state to tell them on the first days after Chernobyl what happened and what to do in order to ensure health and safe life of them and their children. And as a result, anything that came from official sources was distrusted. People just didn't trust what was told them by the government anymore. And it is quite an awful thing. And when people do not trust competent authorities in how to manage disaster aftermath. And actually, there is an opinion that that was one of the key factors that led the Soviet Union to the collapse. The prime example of this mistrust is a discussion around acceptable doses of ionizing radiation. Basically, those acceptable doses is the first thing one needs to know in order to manage a nuclear disaster. And any political decisions and a lot of management action would be based on the safe thresholds for the committed, effective, lifelong dose of ionizing radiation. In the Soviet Union, this safe threshold was established in 1988 and it was 35 rem or Röntgen equivalent man. This is also equal to 350 millisieverts. It was proposed by Leonid Ilyin, who was at that time the director of the Institute of Biophysics of the USSR Ministry of Public Health, and by Yuri Israel. At that time, he was head of the USSR State Committee for Hydrometeorology. Both were renowned scientists and radiological hygiene and radiological medicine. It was an emerging field at that time, and there were prominent figures in this field. This policy was contested by the academic and policy communities of the Belarusian and Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic of that time. And in particular, in April 1989, the Belarusian Academy of Sciences submitted to the government and the Communist Party of Belarus and Soviet Socialist Republic a special report contesting the concept of 35 rem and calling for more conservative threshold for managing Chernobyl aftermath. This report was forwarded to the Central Federal Soviet government. The Soviet government had rejected the report by Belarusian colleagues, and the USSR Governmental Commission for the Liquidation of the Aftermath of Chernobyl had approved the concept of 35 rem as law. With all the scientific evidence available at that time and even available nowadays, we can say that the concept of 35 rem was conservative enough. Moreover, the government of the Soviet Union initiated an international initiative called the International Chernobyl Project. This initiative was a joint activity of the International Atomic Agency, the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, of the World Health Organization, and the International Red Cross. And basically, the idea of the Soviet government when they launched this thing was to gain some legitimacy from international bodies to prove to their own society, to Soviet people, that the action taken by the Soviet Union was effective, and although probably some mistakes were committed at the very beginning, still It cannot be better than this. And yes, this international Chernobyl project had reaffirmed the validity of the 35 RAM concept and even criticized it as an excessively conservative one. And what is the irony of this initiative? Although indeed it was a very useful effort, like it was platform where a lot of researchers from the Soviet Union, from the Western world could communicate about the issue. They met a lot, they published a lot of interesting reports shedding light on all kind of aspects related to Chernobyl disaster and the aftermath management. The irony of this is that the Soviet Union didn't survive this project, and it collapsed before the project was completed. So basically, the initial purpose of this project, as it was seen by the Soviet government, it did not work out. Nevertheless, the acceptable dose of ionizing radiation, it was a very political subject at that time. It was very heated political topic both in Belarus and Ukraine, Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic and Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, and then in the emerging independent states of Belarus and Ukraine. And as it happened in Belarus, the emerging parliamentary opposition took the debates at the core of the political agenda. They continued to insist that government didn't tell the truth. The measures the government takes, they're not conservative enough, and they demanded the truth, they demanded total transparency, and they demanded more rigorous policy to counteract and mitigate the consequences of the Chernobyl disaster. And at that time, of course, the government couldn't afford to give up the topic to the opposition, so they basically tried to come up even with more rigorous proposal and more conservative ones. Apparently, this topic was very important for citizens and civil society of Belarusian and Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic of that time. To give you an example, the leader of Ukrainian Communist Party of that time, Vladimir Sherbakov, he even banned Ilyin and Israel, the authors of the 35 frame concept, from entering Ukraine. And in Belarus, local newspapers in the Gomel region, such as Mayak Polessia, you can see the photo of this newspaper of around the same time. They were even campaigning for filing a lawsuit against these two scholars, accusing them in bad intentions towards the health and well-being of people of Belarus. Eventually, when Belarus became a fully independent state, the 35 RAM concept was renounced, and the concept of 7 RAM, which is way more conservative, was taken as the basis of the Parliamentary Act on the legal status of the areas exposed to the radioactive pollution caused by the Chernobyl disaster in 1991. The science behind this concept is that the threshold committed effective dose would be 1 millisievert a year. And with the average life expectancy of 70 years, it would make for 70 millisieverts in total. And this debate was greatly influenced by men of letters who had quite a big representation in the Belarusian parliament of this time. And one of them, an influential poet and screenplayer, Alexei Domovich, in particular said that farmers have a close and very special relationship with their soil. They could not limit it, and they by all means will be exposed to radiation way more than it was estimated by Ilyin and Israel. And interestingly, one of the possible drivers for these attitudes of men of letters of that time was influenced by the famous renowned Belarusian poet Vladimir Kratkevich, who died just 2 years before the Chernobyl disaster. In 1960, 26 years before the disaster, he wrote prophetic verses about a girl who were dancing under the rain. She was as happy as never before in her entire life. She enjoyed that rain so much, and she was singing and dancing of joy. And the last line of this poem is the following one: "This rain contains strontium." And I can imagine that when this new regulation was debated in the Belarusian parliament in 1991, these verses sounded in the minds of those people, and also pushed them to take this decision of adopting an extremely super conservative approach to the management of post-Chernobyl aftermath. Safe farming, growing radioactively safe foodstuffs in polluted areas is not impossible as such. And if you do careful selection of species and varieties of fruits and vegetables and other agricultural cultures, you can decrease contamination of your products by 2 or even 3 times. And in principle, most vegetables and most of fruits, they can grow in mildly polluted areas. There is quite a big science behind this, and you have no ideas how many PhD dissertations have been developed and defended in Belarus and Ukraine, and apparently also in Russia, about how to grow safe products in Chernobyl polluted areas, and say how to make safe sausages using radioactively polluted meat. All kinds of information, recommendations, guidelines for safe agricultural practices, they're abundantly available to farmers, to regular citizens. Say I took this picture from an official poster showing like what vegetables are safe here and what are less safe to grow in polluted areas. Same about the berries and fruits. And in principle, if you, as I mentioned, do a smart selection of what you grow, your foodstuffs can be safe enough. It is generally known that safe agriculture is possible on all cultivated areas polluted by cesium-137 under 15 curie per square kilometer. And on this table, you can see some recommendations for newly cultivated areas. And then, depending on what kind of soil you have and what is the level of cesium and strontium pollution, you also can choose what foodstuffs are better to grow in such lands. Other recommendations, they include fertilizing and liming and doing this on a regular basis, and this significantly reduces absorption of radionuclides by plants. And the cooking techniques are very important as well. Say drying and frosting, they should be avoided. Cleaning and peeling, they help a lot and should be encouraged whenever possible. And boiling and maceration, they also reduce the content of radiation in foodstuffs. Also, you can find all kinds of recommendations regarding the safe use of forest products. This is just an example. Depending on what is the level of contamination by cesium-137, you can choose the activity which is safe enough under this specific level of contamination. And here you can see like the whole range of activities, starting from picking up mushrooms up to anything like cutting Christmas trees. Chernobyl disaster and its aftermath is an extremely complex issue that involves not only science but also societal and ethical problems. And as such, physical, chemical, health, and societal, economic, just you name it, context of Chernobyl disaster, they're far beyond something where science can give us valid answers to our questions. And this is a domain of post-normal science. And in post-normal science, the function of science policy interfaces is to provide versions of serviceable truths. So politicians have some guidance about how to act in this extremely complex situation. Nowadays, we hear a lot of critique toward the action taken by the politicians in late 80s and early 90s. We hear that they were too conservative and the economic and societal cost of the overly conservative action was too high. And this is just one of the examples of this kind of discourse. I found this very interesting citation that authors from Rosatom's Nuclear Safety Institute, they blamed artists and men of letters of that period, late 80s and early 90s, in aggravating the situation and furnishing the public with opinions which were not based on science, but which were too emotional. And they argue that this resulted in unprecedented and wasteful economic losses and even in public health issues, as being wrongly identified as exposed to harmful levels of ionizing radiations, people were under stress. However, even with the knowledge of today, it is quite difficult to have a qualified judgment on what politicians of late 80s and early 90s did. We can see, and this is our qualified guess, that yes, indeed, that action was very conservative. Probably it was not such a bad thing. Just to give you a reference from a more recent take on safe thresholds, the Japanese radiation authorities, after Fukushima happened, they recommended to establish 1 millisievert a year as acceptable dose threshold for radiocesium and transuranic alpha emitters for the radiation intake associated with foodstuff. So basically, this is very close to what the Belarusian legislators adopted in early 90s. However, this represents only a portion of the total annual intake, while life expectancy is longer in Japan. So this is, although about the same, still a little bit less conservative than in Belarus at that time. Once we established a threshold for committed lifelong dose, the next challenge for science and for science policy interactions is to find actually how to measure the actual exposure, especially exposure coming from low levels of radiations. The challenges here is the following. With high levels and even with medium levels of radiation, things are relatively easy. We have a lot of experiments, we have a lot of evidence, and we know what happens to bodies when they're exposed to high levels of radiation. However, if radiation comes in small doses but does so over very long periods of times, then we do not have such clear evidence, and we do not really understand what happens to bodies and what health effects follow. The official concept proposed by UN bodies, it happened already in 1970s and it's still valid, is the linear non-threshold hypothesis, or LNT. And it assumes that ionizing radiation, regardless the dose and the intensity, may cause cancer, even long after the actual exposure. And it would be much easier for policy to have a certain threshold, and we would know about this threshold that anything below it is safe and anything above it is dangerous. But such thresholds do not exist, unfortunately, although there is quite a big research work in looking for such a threshold. That said, LNT is very difficult to operationalize because managers they need clear-cut thresholds in order to manage the issue. And the approach taken in Belarus was to combine the 7RAM concept adopted in 1991 with zoning based on ecosystem pollution and the availability of environmentally safe agriculture. And in Russia and first in Ukraine, they adopted similar approaches. And basically, the assumption here is that if we have a certain level of soil pollution in certain place, then we assume that the exposure of human beings to radiation would be about the same within this area with similar levels of soil pollution, which is of course gross oversimplification, but one needs to start somewhere. This is what it looks on a map of Belarus. You can find here all kinds of zones, starting from the zone of the immediate evacuation or an exclusion zone, where the level of radiation is the highest. Then there are other zones with low levels of pollution. And the safest one is the inhabited zone with periodical radiological control, where it is assumed to be safe to live. However, in order to ensure that the actual exposure is still acceptable, some periodical radiological control should be in place. And indeed, there is a procedure to make sure that the levels of contamination are acceptable. And this procedure is an annually updated list of settlements classified to different zones. And this list is compiled based on the data of soil pollution and on annual effective doses. And those annual effective doses, they're calculated using the regularly updated catalog of effective annual doses. This catalog contains relations between the actual pollution and the measured exposure. And this is a very curious document. Independent researchers in Belarus insist that it is not conservative enough, because when they run actual measurements with whole body counters, they usually find that the levels of exposure they measure, they are much higher than it would be according to the catalog. And this catalog is not peer-reviewed, and its methodology and findings, they're not really publicly discussed. And there are no publications discussing this, so it's a little bit obscure document, and it gives an impression that science policy process here is not transparent enough. There are more disturbing signs of low transparency in science policy process around Chernobyl aftermath in Belarus. For instance, during the recent decades, we see that lower health risks in the official documents are associated with exposure levels. And the implication of it that lower welfare incentives for the inhabitants of polluted areas are established. Say, more economic activities are recognized as safe to carry out in polluted areas, and even the official list of the elements officially related to radiation risks is cut by 2 times. This can be associated with new scientific evidence indeed, but also with a genuine interest in cutting costs spent on Chernobyl aftermath management. This overall trend of lowering thresholds also neatly coincided with the overall turn in Belarusian Chernobyl policy. In 2009, the president of Belarus has announced that the period of overcoming the Chernobyl aftermath is over now, and polluted areas, they need to be returned to the economic circulation. And that followed with several governmental reforms. Also, the whole body of Chernobyl-related legislation has been revised. Also, some new barriers to independent radiological research has been set up, and NGOs dealing with any kinds of post-Chernobyl issues have been either closed or forced to reduce their operations really a lot. And the other consequence was that all the public money they have been channeled to a very limited group of research organizations. If before nearly any Belarusian research organization, any research group dealing with anything that had to do with food production, food safety, medicine, ecosystems, and so on, they had run some Chernobyl-related research. After this turn in the policies, only some specifically recognized group were authorized to do so, at least using public money for this. To see the whole picture of science policy interactions over Chernobyl, using Belarus as an example, we also looked at what is the representation of Chernobyl-related papers produced by Belarusian academia in the international literature. So in total, we have found 123 Scopus indexed papers from Belarus, with at least one Belarusian author covering Chernobyl aspects. And we, in addition to this, have found 316 RINC indexed papers. RINC, or RINC, this is a Russian scientific database where basically all literature published in Russian is collected and indexed. So it gives really good overview of what's going on in the Russian segment of global academia. So our observation was that 26.8% of all the identified Scopus papers, they were written by all Belarusian teams of authors without any co-authors coming from abroad. And here is the distribution of topics. And in this distribution, we have found some interesting discrepancies between what is published on Scopus and what is published in the Russian database in Russian language. On the topic of food safety, in Scopus, only 0.8 papers are available out of the total Scopus published papers, while in case of RINS, this number is higher by more than 10 times. When it comes to socio-economic policy and political issues of Chernobyl aftermath, they represent only 3.3% of all the Scopus published papers, while in case of RINS, they are 12.3%. And the topic of estimation of effective doses was not covered in any papers indexed by Scopus whatsoever, while in RINS they constituted 15.5% of all the papers published. So basically it means that the international research community appears to be interested only in hard science studies backed by experimental data produced in Belarus, and they were not interested in anything where this data was discussed in terms of specific management implications, policies, societal responses, and so on. And this is, to be honest, sounds a little bit disturbing because, okay, international communities, they have all this hard science, but in case if a new disaster is happening, would it be useful for the international community also to understand what is happening at the level of management and at the level of policy? Also, additionally, we looked at what Japanese authors describing Fukushima aftermath and management of Fukushima disaster, what they cite in their papers. And we have found that none of them cited anything produced, for instance, by Belarusian academia. That also saying quite something. It is a very long lecture already, so here are our concluding remarks. The first one is that politicians can be more prepared for precautionary action than academics, as our study proves. The other one is governments and also business. They want to keep it as cheap and simple as possible. So basically, for complex problem, they have low-tech solutions. Lessons learned from managing and governing radioactive pollution in Belarus and also in Russia and Ukraine, they're unfortunately not accessible by international policy and academic communities. And seems like academic international communities are totally fine about it. And the final question we want to ask, and we still cannot give definite answer to it: would bottom-up societies manage any better with a disaster like a Chernobyl one than top-down societies of Soviet Union and now Belarus did? So I suggest that this is the question you would reflect upon and would try to give your own answer to it. If you're interested in this topic, if you want to know more details, if you want to see literature, I invite you to read the paper we published together with Hannes Krigan from Belarus on Chernobyl science and politics in Belarus. Thank you for your attention. If you have any further questions, please check the paper or drop me an email. You can see the address here. And please do check the syllabus for the literature and the questions. Thank you again. Bye.